Hey, what's up, guys? The Explanation Pro is here. Today I'll explain a American parody vampire movie called Vampire Sucks. Spoilers ahead. The movie begins with high school students celebrating prom with a theme, St. Salvatore Day Festival, like in Italy. Students in red crimson robes filled the fortress-like venue. Becca enters the venue, looking for Edward, who strips himself from clothes in front of everybody. Becca runs towards Edward but comes across a fountain. Becca splashes the water from the fountain, leading the women students to remove their robes and reveal themselves in bikinis. They start partying in the fountain, which angers Becca, so she wrestles the women to arrive at Edward. Unfortunately, the Zultori, a potent and egotistical vampire coven present in the prom, orders his likings to kill Edward for exposing himself to humans. So, Becca jumps high in the air to stop a vampire from attacking Edward. Everything then goes to a flashback. Becca moves into the Pacific Northwestern town of Sporks with her father, Sheriff Frank, because her mother left with another man. Frank still treats Becca like a little girl, denying she's growing up. Upon arriving in the house, Becca enters the bedroom she used to sleep in when she was a baby. She catches a sex doll amongst her belongings that belongs to Frank. Afterward, Becca meets Frank's friends, Jacob and Bobby, in a wheelchair. Jacob and Becca awkwardly introduce themselves while Frank and Bobby wrestle in the background. Afterward, Frank shows his pickup truck gift to Becca, and Jacob brags about fixing the truck's engine himself. Eventually, Becca arrives at her new school. The local students bully her first thing, so she endures all of them while entering the school building. A student named Derek punches Becca on the faces on the hall as welcoming and even shows his exotic selling items. Becca enters the cafeteria and welcomes Rick, who immediately invites her to prom. Then a woman student named Jennifer bluntly says she will serve as a fake friend throughout the whole time. Suddenly, a family of vampires called Sullen enters the cafeteria, who instantly kisses one another after their grand entrance. Becca, on the other hand, gets starstruck by Edward. When Edward sits down, Becca immediately stares at him, which he stares back at her. For a slow moment, they share lingering eye contact. Eventually, Becca enters her biology class and sits beside Edward on the front seat. Edward suddenly wears a hazard suit because he can smell Becca's tuna breath. Although, despite the odd first encounter, the professor shows a vampire diary novel book, and Edward explains its vampire era. Edward then juggles peculiar items from Becca's bag like an apple, a bowling ball, and an infant. After his little show, he hides them again in Becca's bag and leaves the room. Meanwhile, on the docks is a working fisherman that gets interrupted by the predatorial vampires, Antoine, Rachel, and Jack. They look for blood and plans to suck the blood out of the fisherman. After getting cornered, the fisherman puts up a fight but eventually fails and dies from the predatorial vampires. As for Becca, she goes to the school's parking lot to enter the pickup truck. Yet, after getting starstruck by Edward again, she misses avoiding the upcoming van. Edward saves her by thrusting Derek as a shield, which breaks his neck and arms. After the intense save, Derek passes out, and Becca catches her breath. Becca returns home, fantasizing about Edward's peculiar traits and skills displayed at the school. While narrating her fantasies and thoughts, the famous voice narrator from Gossip Girl intervenes but apologizes afterward after realizing she's in the wrong show. After that, Jacob appears with gifts for Becca, but she brutally dumps him instantly. Jacob leaves and Frank exits their house to investigate the fisherman's peculiar death. The fisherman suffers from blood-sucking creatures, and Frank believes it's the Kardashians who must have done it. Before Frank leaves, he gives a pepper spray to Becca to test it on him. Becca uses the pepper spray to Frank's eyes, kicks his groin, and rips off his mustache, proving that Becca can defend herself. Late night, Becca sleeps and wakes up to a sight of Edward in her room, who convinces her that he's just a dream. Becca returns to sleep but suffers from sleepwalking. Edward tries to stop her, but she only almost hit him. Becca calms down eventually, and Edward tries to stare at Becca up close. But after Becca passes gas on his face, causing him to fall off from the window and leave behind his business card on the floor. The following day, Becca goes to school, and Jennifer, Rick, and Derek invite her to the school prom with the theme, St. Salvatore Day Festival. Becca rejects the offer, saying it's not her thing, which upsets Jennifer and leaves her alone. Once alone, Becca confronts Edward about his identity. The two go to the middle of the forest to talk. Becca guesses the truth about Edward, saying he's one of the Jonas brothers, but Edward corrects him saying he's a vampire. He shows off his body in the sunlight, wearing an odd-size bling. Despite Edward's attempt to make Becca hate him, Becca still accepts and admires him. Edward wishes for Becca to go away because he doesn't know if he can hold himself from drinking her blood, and Becca's okay with it. So, Edward invites Becca to prom. At night, Becca wants to hook up with Edward. Suddenly, Edward appears in her bedroom. At first, they slowly lock lips with one another, making Edward blush afterward because it's his first to reach first base. Fueled by lust, Becca straddles onto Edward to copulate, but Edward stops her. Despite Becca's advances, Edward finally throws her towards the roof. She falls back into her room and agrees to an official relationship. Meanwhile, Jacob, in his half-form werewolf, Frank, and Bobby chase down the predatorial vampires. Despite the truth about the killers as the vampires, Frank believes it's the Canadians. On Becca's birthday, the Sullens throws a birthday party for her. So, Edward brings Becca to his home. At first, everyone introduces themselves to Becca. Then Iris, a foreteller who predicts her upcoming period, offers Becca to open the gifts prepared for her. When Becca is unwrapping a gift, she gets a paper cut, causing blood to drip off from her fingers. Edward's brother, Jeremiah, holds a fork and knife and runs towards Becca. Edward instantly throws Becca to the wall to save her and tosses Jeremiah onto the piano. Unfortunately, Becca cuts her arm next because of hitting the glass, and she lets the blood flow onto the glass towers, making a blood cocktail. Edward's other brother and father drink one of the glasses, causing themselves to berserk and jump towards Becca. Edward saves Becca and traps his brother and father in a high-tech coffin machine. He burns them inside by setting the machine in high voltage. Meanwhile, Edward's mother, sister, and Iris smell Becca's blood from the bleeding nose, so Edward brings Becca outside. When they open the door, a delivery guy holding a Chinese meal is waiting for the Sullens to retrieve the order. So, Edward uses the delivery guy as food for his female family members as a substitute for Becca's blood. Edward's family sucks the life out of the delivery guy while Edward carries Becca to the woods. They travel fast enough as if they're flying. Yet, upon arriving in the middle of the woods, it turns out he's only riding on a motor scooter. In the woods, Edward breaks up with Becca because being with him is a dangerous life for her. Becca offers to be a vampire, but Edward can't let it happen. Becca is too beautiful and should live life normally. Before leaving, Edward warns Becca not to do anything reckless. He kisses her forehead, rides his motor scooter once again, and leaves. Becca watches him leave but later calls for his name repeatedly. While shouting his name, she trips on a tree root and throws a tantrum like a kid. Suddenly, the three predatorial vampires arrive to kill Becca for blood. When they're about to attack her, Becca sprays her pepper spray, but the three vampires crouch so fast she hit a different woman holding a stake to help her. The woman leaves, allowing Jack to bite Becca first, followed by Rachel and Antoine. Luckily, Edward arrives to save her. Jack then attacks Edward next, but he easily blows off its head with a bat. Jack's head goes inside Frank's police car, who barely shows care at all on whether what entered his car, believing it's only the Kardashians. Edward successfully fends off Rachel and Antoine, but Becca suffers from a sudden poisoning from the bite. So, Edward sucks out the poison off her blood from her bitten arm. After saving Becca again, he leaves for the last time. Edward suffers from loneliness and a broken heart for months. Everywhere she looks, everyone seems to remind him of Edward. Every night, she screams in her sleep because of nightmares. Frank tries to comfort Becca with his terrible parenting but only ends up insulting her. Before leaving, he reminds her to hang out with her friend, Jennifer too. Frank then leaves with his sex doll to get busy because he misses his wife. Becca follows her father's advice and joins Jennifer in a cinema. After their little friends date, Jennifer comments the movie will flop. When they leave the cinema, it turns out the movie is The Twilight Saga, Breaking Dawn. Afterward, they walk away from the entrance, where Jennifer spoils the ending, making the people in queue mad. Later, they come across a boutique selling gowns. Becca stares at a beautiful pink daring gown, thinking it must have been nice to wear it. But Jennifer reminds Becca she can't wear a gown anymore because Edward dumped her, meaning she doesn't have a date for prom. So, Jennifer suggests it's a perfect gown for her and even brags about it. In Becca's mind, she imagines stabbing Jennifer repeatedly but later refocuses herself to the present. Jennifer then stops by at her parked car, while Becca's car is on the other side of the street, surrounded by mean-looking bikers. Becca walks to her car, trying to keep things cool until one of the bikers catcalls her. Suddenly, a ghost of Edward warns Becca that it's dangerous, which is proven when one of the bikers throws a bottle on her forehead. The following day, Becca tries on the new motorcycle given by Jacob. Afterward, Becca asks Jacob what changed in him despite the obvious reason of being a werewolf due to his hairy feature, animal nose, and tail. Jacob reveals he's a practicing mitzvah, which Becca greets her in Jewish. Jacob attempts to ask Becca numerous times if he can date her now, but it turns out Becca doesn't really want him. So, she cuts off the wire for the motor's brake and drives recklessly on the road. She keeps seeing Edward's ghost, stopping her from her plans. Suddenly, Becca sings with her guitar like Taylor Swift but throws it away and drinks a carton of milk to trigger her lactose-intolerant stomach. Becca gets thrown away on the road, hitting her head on the ground. Jacob eventually arrives to help Becca. He removes his shirt to clean her wound on the head and leaves fast to call for backup. Suddenly, another hand offers Becca to stand up, only to reveal Antoine alive. Becca escapes to the woods but gets caught quickly. Antoine shows that Rachel's been recast, the reason why he's the only one left. But Jacob arrives to save her, yet only to transform into a chihuahua. Jacob brings her werewolf friends that dance first and afterward dismember Antoine's limbs to peace. Meanwhile, Edward stays in Rio, looking homely. Suddenly, Iris visits Edward to inform him that Becca killed herself. Edward calls Becca's home, but it's Jacob who answers it, saying that Becca's father, Frank, is at a funeral, but he didn't know it was the fisherman's funeral and not Becca's. Edward thinks that Becca's dead, so he chooses to aggravate the Zoltori into killing him by revealing the vampire's existence. Suddenly, Iris receives another vision that Becca's alive, but she's too late because Edward has already left. The following day, Iris drives to Becca's house and fetches Becca to tell her to stop Edward from getting himself killed by the Zoltori. So, they travel to the prom. Out of nowhere, Jacob jumps down on Iris' car hood, demanding Becca's answer, but when a cat appears on the road, Jacob chases it off. Becca arrives at prom but gets caught in an ongoing war between Edward and Jacob fangirls, making her unable Edward at the end of the venue, who's exposing himself from the humans. However, the sky reveals Twilight, then a new moon, and an eclipse, thus making Edward become human-like, removing his vampiric nature. Unfortunately, Darrow, the Zoltori leader, catches Edward and battles non-stop on the party while the rest of the Zoltori captures Becca. Suddenly, Frank comes to the party to check on Becca, but she gets disappointed because despite revealing her father the truth about supernatural beings, Frank thinks it's part of the prom's theme and leaves. The movie ends with Darrow and Edward's fight to an end. Darrow forces Edward to turn Becca into a vampire or else get killed. Edward agrees to turn Becca only if she marries him. Becca accepts the offer, becomes a vampire, and wears a ring given by Edward. Later, the leader of Jacob's fangirls struck Edward on the head but survived it. The vampire Becca then attacks the leader of Jacob's fangirls. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and also subscribe my channel for more videos like this. See you in the next video.